Hey guys, Mr. Bostic here. Welcome back to Classical Greece. It's time now for us to jump into part 3 of chapter 7, covering drama. Keep in mind though, these days we tend to use the word drama more as a word to suggest that the subject matter is heavy and serious only. But really, drama is all kind of theatrical performances, and its two parts are tragedy and comedy, as you, of course, already know from having read the text. So let's go ahead and jump in. As you'll recall, it really all starts with Dionysus, or rather, the Athenian, particularly in Athens, the celebration of the festival of Dionysus, and who, keep in mind, he's the god of wine, of revelry, of youth. Sometimes there's a long list of things really that they'll describe him as being the patron of. And typically, as you see here in one of the images, followed by a whole host of characters, with chariots led by either sometimes leopards, or tigers, or lions, and quite in some ways, a very fun-loving deity they saw him to be, but in other ways kind of fierce. And so, as part of his celebration, if you recall back at the time of Pisistratus, you had a whole tradition of public celebration come around telling stories, originally the stories of Dionysus, right? So why is it this we get this word goat songs? Of course, it's not goat singing. Goat songs has a simpler explanation. Basically, one of the main types of followers for Dionysus were the satyrs, and they were understood to be half goat, half man, right? So the legs of a goat, kind of like you'll remember from Narnia, Mr. Tumnus is a faun. Well, a faun is just a Latin word for the same thing as a satyr, right? And so these, in a festival of Dionysus, they had his followers telling his story, or people dressed up as satyrs, wearing goat skins and telling the story in what was basically just the chorus, right? And moving back and forth, singing part after part, right? And from this, they get this concept of goat songs, or tragadoi, as our book tells us. So you'll see various other versions like the one here, without getting too much into the Greek. I mean, we'll stick with the term that we use in the book. But it's this concept of goat songs comes from the satyrs and the followers of Dionysus. You see here at the bottom even an ancient cup, pretty typical for the god of wine, but shaped like the head of a goat. Right, and to present these plays publicly, and keep in mind there were religious festivals. This wasn't just a pastime or an entertainment. They were understood to be a religious festival, and in fact, the whole idea that they had was that through seeing these experiences, there was a certain kind of, the word they use, we still use it in English, is catharsis, that you experience something by watching it, and you go through the sufferings along with the characters. They created these beautiful theaters. Some of them are really well preserved, and there are quite a lot of them. They would build them into the hillside. They were always open air theaters, and the central area down at the bottom, you can see here depicted, is called the orchestra. Right? We still use that term. Then the theatron is the seating area. It's always a semicircular section here. And over here, you can just barely see in this image, is the skene. Now, of course, you change the K to a C, as you see in this diagram, and it's not hard to see that we're still using these terms. All right. Now, what you see here at the bottom is the chorus, or something a little like the original version of a chorus. It's a group of people down at the bottom in front of the skene in the orchestra. There would have been an altar here actually as well. And remember, this is a religious festival. And moving back and forth, singing, in fact, the tale, right, depicted in the play. At first, these plays didn't involve what we would think of as actors and presentation, redepiction of the events. It was more a telling of the tale, right? Of course, things developed from there. Okay. Now, here we have three different depictions, really of the same place. There's down here an artistic representation of what it would have looked like originally in its heyday, with the crowds, the Athenian crowds, and the chorus down below, the skene, or as we would say, scene back here. Right. This is a modern photograph, of course, of people gathered in the ruined, or rather semi-reconstructed, theater of Dionysus in Athens, and then a picture down below where you can see, in the daytime, it's sort of semi-ruined status. Now, one thing that's interesting to note, and I'm going to back up here just a second, when you go to one of these theaters, I believe this is the one at Epidaurus, it's one of the best preserved, there's a stone down in the middle, and you can go all the way to the top seats, and if someone standing on that stone drops a coin, you hear it. The Greeks were amazing at developing these theaters with really great acoustics. In fact, modern scientists still to this day don't really know quite how to develop them with acoustics that are quite this perfect. And keep in mind, they needed that because they didn't have microphones. They didn't have any means, well, any of the means that we have, of projecting voices and having a large crowd of people. And frequently, keep in mind that this is a whole festival with lots of plays, people moving in and out, people talking, being able to kind of transmit the sounds and have people follow the play. So they had to use the tricks that they could, and the acoustics really helped them in that matter. Right. Another thing that helped them here were the masks. Now, to this day, the masks, in fact, it's the pair of masks. You have a mask for tragedy, and you have a mask for comedy. Right? Notice the tragedy, shocked, sad, usually is the way it's depicted. The comedy, the modern version is laughing, right? A lot of the ancient depictions of it are sort of kind of strange, usually ugly, sort of commoner character. And notice what he's got around his head, of course. Grape leaves with grapes. You see in the photograph to the right a kind of modern redepiction of a chorus. They would often be kind of frightening masks. But one of the things that they did, and you can kind of tell from the shape, is these masks served kind of like cupping your hands around your mouth and help you project your voice. And so the mask would depict the character in play, and it also would help project the voice, and it would also help hide the fact that, remember, all these actors are men. Lots of times the characters are women, but the actors are always men, and that held true even through Shakespeare's day until much later. Right. And that should remind us here. We see, in fact, one of these images is a depiction of a Shakespeare play going on at the reconstructed Shakespeare Globe Theatre in London. The whole Western tradition of drama follows on the Greeks. All the developments all the key foundational developments that the Greeks came up with by the classical period have became and really remained the basis of drama ever since. And it's important to keep that in mind, whether we're talking about plays from 400 or 500 years ago, the development of opera shortly thereafter into theatrical performances in a modern day sense, the translation of that into a movie theater where the action's going on not on a stage with live people interacting back and forth, but pre-recorded and projected, but notice in a theater. It's very much a kind of new technological translation of the same thing, and even the further steps into modern TV or Netflix. I mean, you have the same foundations, the same developments of the kind of the inherent nature of drama still very much working for the Greeks, and anyone who studies drama today will very much start with the Greeks. In fact, many of the Greek plays, the most famous Greek plays, are still really frequently produced. So it's a testament to the real foundational character. People don't reproduce them just because they're supposed to. They do because they're really great drama. Now, at this point, it's going to be important for us to get a kind of handle around, what is tragedy and what is comedy. I mean, we might kind of think that we know what they mean, but we might not quite get all of it. The basis is this, that with any story, and this is still true to this day in novels or what have you, there's going to be a conflict, right? So both involve a conflict, and they both have to resolve that conflict. conflict, but the real key difference between tragedy and comedy is that tragedy involves absolute unavoidable suffering, pain and suffering in order to put things right, as well as the fact that tragedy always centers around a noble character. Now, in our modern democratic age, we shift that a bit, but all the way up to the time of Shakespeare, it was absolutely the rule that the tragic hero would be a nobleman, and he would have a heroic flaw, and either through that flaw or through just unavoidable fate, he would suffer things and have to suffer things to kind of right some wrong that happened half the time an accident, something he couldn't even control. Death and catastrophe are often involved, but eventually it's resolved, but always through suffering. Now, in comedy, it's kind of the flip side of that. I mean, there's a conflict, but things manage basically to work out without the suffering. They kind of skate by, they get a pass, right? Likewise, it's almost never really the same kind of cast of characters. It's not noblemen that are the main protagonists of a comedy. It's usually commoners that are the main characters. Sort of bumbling through this, the cases of mistaken identity, confusions, but things get resolved in the end. One thing people often point out is that comedy is very often in the wedding. That's definitely true with Shakespeare, and and since. But that's sort of a side point. A key thing to remember about comedy is that though they're often funny, they're not essentially funny. The point isn't that it's humorous. The point is that you get to escape. You sort of get an eject seat that works everything out without the suffering. And, also that they're typically about kind of common issues. They're sort of brusque and burly and a little off color, right? It's, not hard to see that that's often true to this day. Now, down to sort of the meat and potatoes of this section, the three great tragedians. Now, we can't go through all the details that your book has given you here, and you don't need to know all of them, but keep in mind, it's important to see kind of what they have in common and who they are, what they're famous for individually, right? Now, remember, this is not only a religious festival, but it's a great public celebration in Athens, this Dionysian festival. And there were contests held for who could write the best plays. And in fact, they typically weren't just writing individual plays, they were writing trilogies, a set of 3 plays that were interconnected in characters and theme, right? And there was a prize for who would win the best ones, who wrote the best play that particular year. These 3 tended to win the prize most often. And the first great father of tragedies is Aeschylus. Right? Now, he wrote, according to his ancient historical sources, at least 80 plays, but we only have 7 of them. I mean, this is quite common with a lot of things that we know existed in ancient writings, but we no longer have available to us. Right? Now, he's best known for his Orestean trilogy. And remember, this is Orestes, the son of Agamemnon. And Agamemnon, when he gets back victorious from the Trojan War, is killed by his wife Clytemnestra. Right? So he's in a double bind. Right? He is supposed to avenge his father's death. To do so, he has to kill his mother and subject himself to the Furies. Right? And we've talked in class already about that. This really produces the same kind of plot that's been used again and again and again, from Hamlet to The Lion King. Right? So it's a with important shifts of setting and also plot details. But the point is that foundational problem of the main character being caught in a bind and not knowing what to do is a major theme, and it goes back to Aeschylus. Right? The next great Greek tragedian is Sophocles. He wrote more than 100 plays, but once again, we only have 7 of them. Personally friends with Pericles, Herodotus, Euripides, our third great tragedian. Right? The great men of his day. In fact, for 30 years, he won either first or second place in this competition to write the best tragedy for the Dionysian festival. So, a great writer, and he's best known for Oedipus Rex. Now, once again, that's part of a trilogy, and it's about a legendary king. In fact, almost all tragedies tend to be about legendary, mythical, or semi-historic mythical characters, and noblemen. Right? And the basic story of Oedipus, your book gives it to you, but it's not quite as simple as that. Remember, the name Oedipus means pinned feet. And why? Well, his proud parents who, the king and queen of Thebes, believe that, they're waiting to have a child, and when they finally have a child, they rush off to Delphi to find out what glorious future their child will have. And the oracle at Delphi tells them, your son will kill his father and marry his mother. And of course, they're horrified, right? So how could they escape this fate? Well, they have his feet pinned together, and they put him out and expose him on the mountainside to prevent the fate. But what happens? But a shepherd comes along and finds him and sees that he's healthy except for his pinned feet, and takes him and raises him. And later on in life, he raises him in the neighboring kingdom. Later on in life, it's discovered, that who he is, and he well, put it this way. Later on in life, he ends up going himself to Delphi and being told, you'll kill your father and marry your mother. And by this time, he's been adopted by the king and queen of the neighboring kingdom, right? So he doesn't want to do that. And so he said, well, I'll solve that. I won't go home. And so he goes somewhere else. And on the way to somewhere else, he runs into a king. He doesn't know who it is, but a man on the road, and gets into an argument with him and kills him. And then proceeds on and gets to Thebes and saves Thebes from the riddling Sphinx. And they're so grateful to him that their queen, whose king never comes back, ends up marrying him, and he becomes king of Thebes, and he's a great king, and everyone loves him. But things are wrong, and people start to suffer, and plagues start to come, and he sends off to Delphi again to find out what's wrong, and he finds out it's him. And bit by bit, the facts come out, and he discovers this man he killed on the road was his actual father, and the queen that he married is his actual mother. And and before he realizes what's going on, she's already realized it, and she ends up hanging herself. And the horror of it, he gouges his own eyes out and exiles himself to save his city. Where everyone's been trying to avoid this fate, and by trying to avoid it, they've made it come true. So this is exactly the kind of thing that Greeks mean by inescapable fate. Right? Now, Euripides, third great tragedian, wrote more than 100 plays, or around 19 of his survive. Right? Many of them very popular. There's a special technique that he tended to use a lot. It's called Deus ex machina, meaning something or someone kind of swoops in at the end, and they used a crane in this case. It came from Medea, where they swoop her out of the scene, lifting her out with a crane. And that's the machina, the machine, right? And so a god out of the machine is what the phrase means. And, your book makes reference to that. But, it's something that's used certainly beyond the time of the Greeks in drama. Right. Now, last thing. We've talked a lot about the tragedies, and they tended to dominate. But you also have the tradition of comedy, right? And though it's not always funny, many times it is. Or usually picks fun at current issues, whereas tragedy deals with historical or mythological settings. This tends to deal very directly with current day issues and people. Tragedy might allude to current day by comparison, but he doesn't usually deal directly with it. Right. And the most famous writer of comedies is Aristophanes. Right? His plays tend to be called things like The Clouds, or Frogs, or Wasps. And, and he depicts ridiculous things going on. Or, in one case, Socrates, who was alive in the time, suspended up in the sky with a basket, in a basket, and handing out his philosophy from the clouds, right? He's he loves to kind of jibe and jest. In fact, very frequently he was picking on Pericles, who everyone admired and followed, or later Cleon, who fewer people tended to admire, the demagogue who followed Pericles, and we'll get to him more in the next section, or actually 2 sections from now. And not only is he putting Socrates up in the clouds, but he's kind of making fun of his new teaching, right? Which is the full flowering of classical Greek philosophy that we're about to deal with in our next section. And I leave you here with a quote from Aristophanes, which is kind of funny: that youth ages, immaturity is outgrown, ignorance can be educated, and drunkenness sobered, but stupid lasts forever. these pointed, kind of jabby sort of comments. But he's, Aristophanes was, as you can imagine, really popular with the crowds. He tended to do kind of outlandish things that gathered a lot of popular appeal. All right, guys, that kind of wraps our discussion today of tragedy and comedy, of the general Greek dramatic tradition that we still very much rely on in our entertainment industry. It's really built on the basis of the Greeks. Hope everything's going well for you, and we'll talk to you soon.